Thank you, Pat, and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dave Sprinsanatic, and one time I served as state engineer, and this morning when Garland Early, state engineer, introduced the program, he made a comment about this is an effort that actually began about 20 years ago, which is true. When I was a state engineer, we tried to do something like this and, just couldn't get it far enough along to, to get traction and to put something into place. And as you all know, and Pat pointed out, the legislature mandated that a life cycle cost analysis be developed and an economic analysis. And through, being with HDR now, we were fortunate enough to get the contract to put together the models and guidance, for the two analyses. So for me, it's good to be here today, having been here 20 years ago when this all started, and to be able to see sort of the fruits of a lot of labor on behalf of a lot of people over the years. The one question, how many of you were not here this morning? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay. Because we weren't quite sure how to do the lead-in this afternoon, since we went through a process this morning of addressing basic economics and why we do what we do from the standpoint of a government in considering projects. So my two colleagues that are with me today, first it's Jeremy Cook, who's a senior economist with HDR, and Dr. Jay Leach, who's a former professor at North Dakota State. The two of them were the ones that did the work to pull this model together and to get us to this point today. And as I turn it over to them, what they're going to do is an abridged version of what most of you heard this morning in terms of government economics and projects. And then we'll get into the actual workings of the economic analysis. And hopefully you'll have some questions and comments, and we certainly appreciate them. So, Jeremy?
Just one other quick comment, just a housekeeping thing. There is coffee and water at the back of the room, and also we are recording this, so we can post it online later on as a webinar, so those that can't be here will have access to both the workshops. So if you have questions, we'll bring a microphone to you so we can get the audio from those questions. Thanks.
Jay?
Whoa, already. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm trying to put the whole thing into context, and those of you that were here this morning, I might change the context a little bit just to keep it interesting. Did anybody think of an example that wasn't an economic decision? Well, keep thinking. I want to know one before I fully retire. Government has 4 roles. Efficiency, and that's the efficient allocation of our resources. Equity, the distribution of income, and I heard the word fair coming from Valley City. Want a fair distribution of income, that's a role of government. And what I said this morning, if you're interested in that, look up GINI, the Gini coefficient, and it talks about the distribution of income in different countries and economies. Stability, government's role is to stabilize the economy by changing the interest rate, changing the money supply, doing some other things to kind of flatten it out. And growth. What we're mainly talking about here today is the state's role in efficiency, in efficient use of society's resources. Economics. What's the definition of economics?
The study of how individuals, groups, organizations, firms, or governments allocate their scarce resources among competing uses.
She was here this morning. See how quick she caught on? It's a study of how all kinds of entities allocate scarce resources, and we'll talk about those next, among competing uses to satisfy unlimited wants. We all have unlimited wants. Those are the resources we have to allocate. Land is all living and non-living endowments of the earth that can and could be used to satisfy man's unlimited wants, from water to eagles to oil to timber. Labor is human labor. Capital, we spell it with a K, is machines, computers, infrastructure that we have to work with. And then entrepreneurship is the ability to put those three things together to make something happen. At the start of each time period, we have a pile of those 4 resources to allocate. The next time period, we might have more resources through discovery, through technology, or we might have fewer resources. There's a guy named Robert Solow who wrote, the Solow article about the lollipop. Each generation should treat resources like a lollipop. You lick on that lollipop and pass it along to the next generation. It's a smaller lollipop, but they have more technology and know how to use it better. So some of our resources are like a lollipop, coal and oil. We lick slowly. What I've always thought, I'm just going to chew the damn lollipop, because what's the future ever done? Okay, those are our resources. Society's production function. I can change this up to keep Dave from Valley City interested here. We can take those 4 resources in a too good economy, and I'm just going to flip this one around. If we use all of our resources to produce one of the 2 goods, we can get this many units of bread. We use them all efficiently. If we don't use them efficiently, we can't get that many units. If we use all of them to produce bunnies, environment, we can get this many. But if we use them all to produce bunnies, we can't get any bread, and vice versa. So there's a production function that says how many combinations of bread and bunnies can we produce with those scarce resources. Now, we could put water projects up here in any one of a number of things, but I can't draw in n-dimensional hyperspace. So we have to go with two goods. So this is the production function. That's the efficient level of producing those 2 along here. We don't want to be in here. We don't want to be down here. We want to use those resources in the best way possible. And efficiency is using that pile, that fixed pile, to get the most output. And output might be chairs, cars, BMWs, hats, clean air, clean water, nice environment, all kinds of outputs. We want to use these to get the biggest pile. Or we set the amount that we want to get out, and we want to use the fewest amount of resources. That's what efficiency is. This morning we talked about LCCA, using the fewest resources to accomplish the water supply goals of municipalities. Now, this afternoon, we're also going to talk about benefits. What do we get out of those? This curve represents what society wants in terms of bunnies and bread. Along this curve, society doesn't care what combination they get, this much bread and this much bunnies, that many bunnies and this much bread. That's called an indifference curve. Our goal in allocating those scarce resources is to get to this indifference curve, to that point where we're efficient and we're giving society as much as we can with what we have, and that's called maximum social well-being. That's the role of government. That's why the legislature said we want to do efficiency analysis so we can get the most out of our pile of resources for society. Over time, if we come up with ways to get more resources, this curve bumps up and we can get to a higher curve. But we're constrained now by the amount of resources we have. So that's our goal, maximum social welfare, well-being, efficiency.
And in an economic analysis framework, where would we fall with a benefit-cost ratio less than 1?
I've been trying to think about that. A benefit-cost ratio less than 1 might not even be. I tried to think about that.
Well, we'd be under the curve somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. We'd be under the curve, but whether we'd be below the axis, I haven't quite thought that through yet.
There's some math there that we'd have to work through. But
And as I said this morning, economists speak 3 languages. We speak words. When we speak to normal people, we speak graphs. When we speak to abnormal people. And the third way, we speak math. Jeremy and I can talk together in math, but if we did that to you, it wouldn't be. For instance,
we'd bore you.
Yeah, the slope of this indifference curve is equal to the slope of the production function at the point of tangency. And you use calculus to figure that out. But anyway, we don't care about that.
So why economic analysis?
Okay, economic analysis is simply the public sector's way of doing investment analysis. Every one of you, as a private sector business owner, does investment analysis. What do you get back for the money that you invest? Public sector does the same thing. The difference in the public sector is The public sector looks at the benefits to whomever, whenever, wherever, and not just to the individual who's making the investment. They look at it society-wide. And our perspective here is the state of North Dakota. That is our benefits and costs perspective, is the state. It's not the nation. That's why we're not doing principles and guidelines in NED. We're doing SED, state economic development. That's our.
So what is economic analysis?
We didn't have that one up there this morning. That's a, well, hopefully it's a logical and systematic approach. And this is all beyond debate. You know, this is all elementary stuff. Economists don't argue about this anymore. It's explicit. We make our assumptions explicit. We come up with explicit answers. It's the broad perspective. As I said, it's everybody, anywhere, anytime is included in our analysis. We quantify things, and I'll talk about function versus benefit later, but if you say, this project does wonderful things for cropland flooding, well, okay, how much? So we quantify it, and it's a forward-looking exercise. We start from today, and we go out typically 50 years into the future.
Oh, yeah, and there's one widely accepted process for conducting economic analysis, that is benefit cost analysis.
And there's a screen up there I can look at. I can
Okay.
see that.
The one thing, Jay, you were mentioning yesterday is benefit cost analysis. There's actually a journal of benefit cost
Oh.
analysis. So
I
getting
just,
to the point where you were saying that benefit cost analysis is fairly standardized. Benefit cost analysis has been around for a long time, started by engineers actually. Economists took it over, but all the points that we're describing here today, standardized. There's no discussion or arguments between economists now between what we should be doing and how we approach things. This is common knowledge.
and I discovered after I retired in 2007, the Journal of Benefit Cost Analysis. So if any of these things intrigue you, just look up the Journal of Benefit Cost Analysis and read a few issues. It'll cure
7
any-
years of it, right?
Yeah, well, 2007.
Oh, yeah, so
Okay, I said this.
11 years.
I said this morning. There's three kinds of people with respect to mathematics: those who get it and those who don't. Okay. From 2007, Jeremy, to 2018 is 11.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah. Okay, economic analysis is the wise use of this pile of resources. That's what economic analysis. How do we use these resources wisely? Financial analysis is once we decide to do something, how do we pay for it? That's the difference. We're concerned about using the resources wisely. That's somebody else's issue about how you're going to pay for it. There are many economic analysis metrics. The legislature didn't dictate. They just said economic analysis. Benefit cost ratio is certainly one that we'll talk a little bit about. Cost effective is just looking at, like we did this morning, LCCA. It's just looking at the cost side, finding the least costly way to accomplish the objective. That's cost effectiveness. Net benefits or present value is taking the present value of the benefits and subtracting the present value of the costs and see how much net your margin is. Internal rate of return is equating when the stream of benefits equal a stream of costs to see what that discount rate would have been. And the payback period is how long does it take you to get your money back in terms of years of the project. But all of these things, you use basically the same metrics. You figure out one is easy to figure out all the rest of them. And there aren't any other ways to measure efficiency.
No, I would just add to the internal rate of return, there's another way of thinking about it, that it's the discount rate that would make benefits to costs equivalent. So, you know, if you have a project right now, we have a 2.875 discount rate in the model. Maybe you can push the discount rate to 7%, and that's the break-even point on benefits minus cost. So it's what discount rate can you afford to increase it to that would actually drive your benefits to costs, benefits and cost equivalent. So
It's fun mathematics to make the discount rate or the benefits equal to costs and then figure out what that interest rate, not a discount rate.
yeah, think of it as a sensitivity analysis.
Yep. Okay, NED, that's National Economic Development. That's what the Corps, the NRCS, the TVA, and whomever else does when they do benefit cost from the national perspective. Anybody, anytime, anywhere in the nation national economic development. We're looking at the same thing, the same procedures, the same metrics from the state perspective. We don't care what goes on in Arizona or North Carolina. If there's some spillover from what we do, that's not our problem. We just care about the state, who pays and who gets the benefits. Separable costs and remaining benefits scrub. That's one I put in there because sometimes we have a good project that has a high benefit cost ratio, and then there's a little pet thing we'd like to put in there that won't stand on its own. So we've got a strip mall, and we want to add a massage parlor. The strip mall is making good money. The massage parlor is a loser, but we put it in with the strip mall and analyze them all together. When you do benefit cost analysis, you do separable costs and remaining benefits. Anything that doesn't have to be in there to make the project work, don't put it in there just because it's a pet project.
A common example I see are like recreation trails.
Yep.
Recreation trails are a separable feature. They have their own costs associated with them. You can build a levee without a trail on it. Yep. And so a lot of times, either the trail gets added to help justify the flood control project, or vice versa, the recreation trail gets tacked on because there's not enough benefit from a recreation standpoint to justify the trail that the locals wanted. So,
and I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking recreation trail. That's why I needed to go to the massage parlor at the end of the day, because I'd spent all day on the recreation trail.
Real quick, also RED.
RED is Regional Economic Development. RED measures three things. It measures the change in the number of jobs, the change in the amount of local taxes that are generated, and gross business volumes. It has nothing to do with economic analysis. It's socioeconomic impact on the region. Let me do one thing quickly. Gross business volume. One of our responses back several months ago said, well, the multiplier in agriculture is 7. You've all heard about the multiplier effect. Spend $1, it turns into 7. Well, in fact, in North Dakota, the livestock multiplier is the highest multiplier in North Dakota, and that's 4.49. All the rest of them are lower than that. You have a 17-sector model where here's 17 sectors in North Dakota, 17 sectors down here, and you do a transactions matrix, all the stuff that changes hands across those sectors, and some of the stuff leaves, it leaks out of the region. Then you do an I minus A matrix and flip it around, and it tells you when you spend $1 in one sector, what the gross business volume is in the region. Now here's the gimmick of gross business volume. I give her $1, she sells something, she keeps a nickel, and she passes 45 cents to you and 50 cents to you. You each keep a nickel, and then you buy inputs, light bulbs and labor and stuff, and pass the rest on, and then you each got some of their money, you each keep a nickel and pass it on. Well, the only thing that really matters is the nickel. That's the return to households, the return to personal income. That's never more than the original $1. The other stuff you add up, the 95 cents, the 50 cents, the 45 cents, you add all that up, and that's what the multiplier is. So next time you go to a meeting and somebody says, yeah, the dollar turns over 7 times, this is really a good deal. Well, that's not really a good deal. What's a good deal is how much ends up in personal income or in households.
You want to talk also about the relationship between RED and SED? Just so we can kind of clear that up.
Explain it to me.
So RED, if we're thinking about this here, expenditures are that relationship with RED. So you spend more or you increase output on agricultural production, there's expenditures that link through the economy, right? In the end, there's this multiplier effect that Jay's talking about. SED is somewhat related to that in that if we're thinking about agricultural production, what we're concerned about with SED and the benefit cost framework are not necessarily the expenditures of that, but that expenditures actually is part of the equation of estimating SED. So when we're thinking about agricultural production, we're thinking about the incremental gain in farm rents, for example, to the producers. So if you reduce, say, or you increase crop production, there's revenues that go to the farmer, and what they've incurred in terms of cost for production, those costs, those expenditures, or their output would have been valued in the regional economic development analysis, but we're netting out their costs, and that incremental profit, that farm rent, is actually what we're valuing the benefit cost framework, the SED. So they're connected, but they're different.
That's exactly what I was going to say. So the feds don't care about regional economic development because if you do something in North Dakota that creates jobs, you may be just moving jobs from Nebraska to North Dakota, and from the federal perspective, there's no gain. And in North Dakota, doing economic analysis, we don't necessarily care about jobs that transfer from one county to another county because the number of jobs is still there. So if you do a project in a 4-county region that creates jobs, unless they're net new jobs, they don't make any difference. They just move from one place to another.
Yep. Economic time horizon and period of analysis. So period of analysis is the time over which benefits and all costs that we're looking at accrue for the project. In this case, we're looking at 50 years. 50 years is the generally accepted time horizon for water resource projects. You don't want to go beyond that because, as Jay mentioned this morning, 500 years, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. There's things like adaptive management that would change the way local communities deal with flooding. So in this case, we limit that to 50 years, which is a reasonable time horizon for a life of a project.
Like I said this morning, they never let me teach freshman or sophomore classes because I keep going off on tangents. They never let me teach more than one section of one class either because I can never remember what I did at the first section. But that's why Jeremy's here. Discount rate and present value.
Go for it.
Okay. This is one of the slippery concepts in economics. It takes a while, but once you get it, you got it. If this is dollars, this is time over 50 years, if this represents our stream of benefits over a 50-year period, and in your project design, I mean, you could have a bump in benefits out here for some reason, but I'm just showing them flat. This is the nominal benefits, or the benefits as on the price tag, but how much is this benefit of $100 worth, $100 50 years from now, how much is it worth today? Ted, would you give me $100 today if I said I'd give it back to you in 50 years? How much would you give me today to give $100 back in 50 years? About $8? Okay, let's see. So Ted's discount rate, if he'd have said $5, his discount rate would have been 6%, but he wanted a little bit more than that, so his discount rate is about 5.5%. If the discount rate is lower, if he discounts the future less, he would have given me 24 cents today to give him, or $24. If his discount rate were 10%, he would have given me less than a penny today. So we need to put those future benefits, future values into real terms back to the present, and we use a discount rate to do that. The current federal discount rate is 2.875. We were talking earlier, maybe our models should just use 3%, and until it changes significantly, if it changes by 1/4 or 0.5%, it doesn't make any difference. But just go with 3% for a few years and see how it works. Back in the Carter years, the discount rate was up here, which means that projects with high upfront costs and benefits spread out over 50 years don't have much of a chance, because this is the curve, we'll say, for 2.875. This is the curve for 6. The curve for 10 is much lower. And the accumulated benefit is the area under that curve. You just integrate the area under the curve, right, using your second semester calculus. Or you can do it longhand, but that takes a long time.
I'd add to this, and I'm just going to throw this out because I was just in California last week, so I'm thinking about this here. California uses 6%. They have a very detailed economic guidance, which is basically a copy and paste from the federal guidelines, the P&G as we refer to it. But they use 6%. They've been using 6% for several years since the guidance was published, and I'm trying to think what year that was, but it's been around a little while, and that's based on the internal rate of return, I believe, to the state, if I recall right. So, but they're actually using a much higher discount rate than what we're proposing here, and really than anyone I've seen actually use, which is interesting to me because California, you think of environmentally minded. So back to our discussion this morning, thinking about the 0% discount factor, they actually kind of work the opposite of way you would think that they're valuing today more than they are tomorrow, even though California's environmental perspective and a lot of their policies are geared towards the future. So it's an interesting.
Or they could have a way to incorporate more environmental values into their calculus.
They do sometimes, yeah.
Everybody good with present value? Dave, you good with that?
There's a quiz at the end.
No, there isn't. Where else?
I had them go.
Oh,
Key
some
concepts.
some concepts, some nuances that we need to think about. When you're doing benefit cost analysis, if you're trying to make a project look good, you think of all the benefits that you possibly can, but don't double count. Don't count the value of increased agricultural production due to flood control and the increase in the value of land. The same thing. You're counting the same thing. Don't count the value of a duck plus the value of a duck hunter, because there's overlap there. They aren't entirely the same because you got duck lookers as well as duck hunters. But be real careful not to double count, because the eyes in Pat's office that will be looking at these EAs will be watching for things like double counting.
It becomes a really sticky issue with environmental issues. Habitat restoration, recreation, ecosystems, what we call ecosystem services. There's a lot of overlap there, and it's very easy to double count very quickly. Yep. So we tend to be very conservative in terms of what we'll count in analysis. So.
But none of us are trying to promote projects or make a bad project look good. We're all trying to do objective analyses. Externalities is unintended side effects on third parties. So if we do something in this 4-county region in North Dakota that impacts somebody outside the region, from a public perspective, when you're asking for money from the entity of the state, those benefits and costs that occur outside the region are also part of the analysis. If you don't ask the state for money and want to stick to your 4 counties, then we don't care what happens in Cass County and Sargent County.
If you do a flood control project, you put in a levee or increase conveyance capacity and dump a lot more water downstream in a channel that can't handle it. Even if you don't account for that, you're creating an externality, a unintended consequence of additional flooding downstream of a project.
And you can have both kinds. You can have external benefits as well, where you do something that benefits somebody outside the area. Sunk costs, when you're doing economic analysis, the money that you spent to the time you start the economic analysis is irrelevant. That's all sunk cost. You just look at from this point forward. Any existing benefits is, you just look from this point forward. So the scheme is to, try to spend as much money on the project as you can until you get to the benefit cost, and you don't have to consider all those before. But sunk costs are not part of efficiency analysis. It's only from this point forward. Benefits transfer, that's a fun one. If we're doing a project up here in Ward County, and part of the project is open space, how much is open space worth? Well, I can't find anything in the literature, but I found something in Clark County, Nevada, where open space was worth $20,000 an acre. And I found something in Orange County, California, where open space was worth $50,000 an acre. And I found something in Cook County, Illinois, where open space was worth $100,000 an acre. So benefits transfer is, I don't know the answer here, but I'm gonna look around and see if somebody else has done it. Well, Ward maybe wasn't a good example, but what's way up in the corner here? What county? Williams County. Okay, let's use Williams County. Would it be appropriate, if we didn't know what open space was worth in Williams County, to use open space value from Orange County, California? Not at all. Pat's sharp eyes will catch that. You want to use open space value from Roberts County, South Dakota, or something similar. Benefits transfer is making reasonable transfers of benefits from another area to the area that you don't know. Function versus value is another slippery one. I recently criticized the person that made a presentation that said The benefit of this project is it reduces nitrogen levels by 60%. That's not a benefit. That's a function. It's a function. It does that. Yep, it does that. But if there's nothing downstream that benefits from that reduction in nitrogen, it's not a benefit. It's a function. We need to go downstream and see who, what, when, and where benefits from that reduction. There's a lot of functions on my phone that I never use. They have no benefit. So you got to distinguish between function and benefit. Sure, it can do it, but unless somebody wants it done, is willing to pay for it, it doesn't have any value in the benefit cost framework. I've done a lot of work on wetlands over the years. And you look at the literature, and the value of a wetland is all of these things. Groundwater recharge. Okay, take a wetland out in Eddy County. No, give me a county where there's bad groundwater.
Dunn County.
Dunn County. Okay, so you got a wetland in Dunn County, and we know from the literature that wetlands recharge groundwater. Is that function worth anything in Dunn County? Well, probably not, because the groundwater has no value, essentially, in Dunn County. So function is not benefit. Function is a step of getting to the benefit. You need to say what it does to whom, quantify it, and put a dollar value on it. And we only use dollars because that's our common denominator. We could use any other numeraire good instead of dollars, but dollars is just a convenient way of doing it. At the margin, economic analysis is looking at changes at the margin and not all or none. One more, one less, 100 more acres, 100 fewer acres, 10 more ducks, 10 fewer ducks, not the whole population of mallards, not the whole population of voice. At the margin, one more, one less. Okay, we already talked about project outputs that benefit anyone, anywhere, anytime. And the same with costs. Project costs for economic analysis, the original implementation and all that, that involves the design, the legal fees, O&M, the costs over time, plus any cost to anyone, anywhere, anytime. In public sector analysis, you dig and dig and dig, and you find every possible benefit and cost that you can to include in the analysis.
So steps for how we do the economic analysis. This really takes from what Jay just covered, thinking about at the margin, discounting, the different ways that we get to benefits in terms of function versus value. So first, what's the baseline? What is the state of the environment today? You know, you have flooding. How much flooding? What does that do in terms of damages? What does that do in terms of value? Going out and assessing that and inventorying what your baseline condition is. Step 2 is to identify what alternatives that you would use to evaluate what alternatives would be effective in dealing with that and going through and evaluating them. So you identify and quantify what benefits and costs you're going to look at. So quantifying, again, getting back to what Jay was saying, you know, we go through and inventory the damages that would be reduced with, say, a project. If you're doing agricultural damages or urban floodwater damages, you'd be looking at some kind of hydraulic analysis to evaluate where the flooding occurs under a baseline condition. What alternative could be used? Is it channel improvements? Is it a retention basin? And then going through and evaluating those hydraulically, coming up with your functions, and then relating to those to the damages in some fashion with what we use or typically are called damage curves that relate the functions then to values in terms of dollar damages, either to crops or to property. And that gives us our benefits and costs. And then from that, we compute our economic analysis metrics, so benefit cost ratios, net present value, internal rate of return, and payback period.
A couple of things. I made these notes in the middle of the night. One thing was priceless. Nothing is priceless to society. To each one of you, there are many things that are priceless. Your relatives, your kids, your spouse, a lot of things are priceless, but to society, no. Nothing is priceless. And I have the biggest problem with the green people when it comes to doing benefit cost, because you cannot put a value on the environment. Well, if you don't, the environment doesn't have a role in benefit cost analysis. The best way to look out for the environment is to put a value on it and stick it in the model. Years ago, I went to Bangladesh and beat up on some French economists at the request of the World Bank, and you can't keep writing these EISs that are this fat that are separate from the efficiency analysis. Because people look at the benefit cost analysis and they read this, yeah, all this nice stuff about the environment. You got to quantify. Nothing is priceless. You got to quantify that and stick it in the efficiency analysis. And we have ways of quantifying all of those things.
There are things that are difficult to quantify,
But not impossible.
but not impossible.
Oh, I was going to say, if you have a question about any of these concepts, just Google it. You know, there's all kinds of information. But I caution you that when you Google something, there's a difference between the gray literature, the literature that is written, say, by Ducks Unlimited, Sierra Club, environmental institutes, and the scientific literature that's refereed in professional articles. And you should always triangulate what you find. Don't just go to one source. Don't just go to the Sierra Club and pick a number out of there. That's the gray literature. It hasn't been reviewed. The journal articles are much better.
And just hitting on that point too, when we talk about like benefits transfer, we're talking about the published scholarly reviewed literature, not the gray literature.
Yep.
When we draw on values, we're going out to academic resources and looking at, okay, who's done a study on the value of salmon in the Pacific Northwest? NOAA is a reasonably acceptable source. They produce literature that actually is peer-reviewed, scholarly reviewed, and those values are reliable. We don't go to, say, Earth Economics or Ducks Unlimited to look for those values of salmon, because either they're going to be highly inflated or they're just going to say there's no value associated with them that we can rely on.
So be careful about your sources, because if you make assumptions or use benefits transfer, you have to make notes about that. And those watchful eyes will catch that. And the last thing I wrote was haircut. I got one the other day. But this is kind of like giving yourself a haircut. You know, you can do it, but you may have to hire an expert to do it over right. So be real careful. There's a lot of nuances.
And what we have here in terms of the model is we've got a set of standard values that are based on work that's Jay's done, work that I've done. All of those values come out of previous benefits transfer studies that we've both looked at, a lot of research that Jay's done over his career, stuff that's reputable and been peer reviewed that is acceptable here. And again, kind of similar to the LCCA process that we talked about this morning, this is a tool. It's been simplified. Getting to the analogy of whether we're 30 pounds off or not, you know, every single application of this model is essentially the same. So, you know, one of the things about economic analysis is you can spend a lot of money to get all the way to 100%, you know, clarity with your economic analysis. But in a lot of cases, though, if you get to 90%, then your analysis is probably good enough to give you a definitive answer. And so this toolkit that you have here now is kind of thinking about getting you to that 80 to 90% range here in terms of an answer that's good enough to give you a decision that if you can refer to the P&G, there's the reasonably acceptable level to justify that benefits exceed costs. And that's really what we're looking for here with this analysis. Maybe you have a very detailed project that's like an urban flood control project, like if you're looking at involvement with the Corps of Engineers. Their analysis is much more rigorous. It's still following a lot of these procedures. It might be a lot more rigorous, but it has to pass certain quantitative tests that they go through. But all of what we have here is really based on a lot of this existing literature and approaches to doing benefit cost analysis. So.
And this is generation one of these models. After a year or so, and we get input back from you folks, and we see some common mistakes being made both by you and by us, generation two will be a better model and will be better than 90%.
Yep.
But we won't know that until we try it for a while.
So before we get into the model, Are there questions? Has everyone read the guidance? Oh,
Okay, let me try. Did anybody read the guidance?
yeah. Who read the guidance?
Okay, one brown nose in the class. He says you read it. Questions are the most fun.
Over any of the topics we've covered so far? No?
Randy, you weren't here this morning. Got any questions? You got that discount rate sorted out? Why we do that? If not, just Google it. Ted,
Oh, wait, hold on.
So you talked about the separation as one of those things that you must do. Separate out a project, and a recreational trail can't be included as a thing.
if it's an integral part of the project, you can't do the other part without it, then it shouldn't be separated. But if it can stand alone, then it should be analyzed separately.
But don't both of those projects engender some reduced cost if they're put together? And is that not a benefit then that we can do?
If there are some synergies in combining the two, sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
But just don't throw in a pet project into a good project to make it fly.
The example I was trying to use is one that I see a lot here, which is like, for example, in Omaha, we have a large recreational trail that goes across the city. And a lot of times what happens is we have a lot of levees for the different streams that go through the city of Omaha. And so a lot of times what happens is, oh, let's put the trail on the levee. And you know what? We're going to use it to connect two segments of the trail that weren't previously connected. Why are you justifying that? Is that really a benefit? Are we going to get more recreators? Are there going to be more people actually going out and using the entire trail network? You know, probably not. Not many, if so. So you're telling me we're going to spend $1 million extra to construct, 5 miles of trail for 5 extra people? Probably not going to be the benefit. Probably not economically justified. That said, if we have recreation is part of like a boat ramp that maybe is connected with a dam. I don't know. Maybe that's something that we could say is economically justified. It just depends on how you look at it and what the features are. The trail one is one that I see a lot that kind of bugs me, so that's the reason why I throw that as an
The Corps of Engineers in the old days used to poo-poo recreation. We build our projects for hydropower, flood control,
navigation.
Recreation, that's silly. Recreation is the 3rd or 4th largest industry in the state of North Dakota if you don't include government. Number 1 could be oil or it could be agriculture. They flip around. Number 3 is manufacturing. Recreation and tourism is probably number 4. It's a big industry, real money. It should be included. It's a benefit. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Maybe something to speak to. A lot of times with flood control projects, we hear about on the benefit side, the avoided damages, but then also the issue of flood insurance and avoided flood insurance premiums.
Jay, do you want to talk to that one first?
Again, that depends on your perspective, I guess.
Yep.
If you're in 4 counties in North Dakota and you could avoid flood insurance, that's probably a benefit. And if it's from the state perspective, the feds are the ones that, well, crop insurance is 60% actuarially sound. It didn't used to be in the old days. So 6 out of 10 years, crop insurance pays its own way. Some work I recently did, I kind of conveniently forgot about crop insurance because if you include crop insurance in the analysis of farmland flooding, there's virtually no damages. They're all recovered. It depends on who you pay the insurance premium to and who pays the damages, whether or not you include crop insurance in the analysis. And what was the question?
I guess the question is, whether or not those avoided flood insurance premiums could be included on the benefit side.
That goes back to, I think, what Jay was saying is who you're paying them to. For example, like if we're talking urban flood damages, like you have an NFIP program, right? National Flood Insurance Program. And those premiums are paid into FEMA, and then FEMA is the insurer, the NFIP program is the insurer, and then they insure against flood losses to properties that are in the flood zone and are insurable under that program. If you're outside of that and you have your own private flood insurance, then those are premiums that you're paying on your own insurance dime. So, go ahead, Jay.
So if insurance in urban property is actuarially sound, the value of the premium is equal to the value of the damages prevented. So that's double counting.
Yep. And that's what I was getting to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's the reason why we don't include them, is because typically what it is the insurance premium is a proxy. It's another way of measuring avoided flood damages, if you will.
Historically, they haven't been actuarially sound.
Yeah.
It's been heavily subsidized, but it's getting closer.
Yeah. So as economists, yeah, we try. That issue comes up a lot. I know I worked on some issues with the Fargo-Moorhead diversion project, and that was one of the things that came up. And on that particular project with the Corps of Engineers, when they were doing their assessment, they did their flood risk assessment to monetize damages, and then what they did, their way of kind of quantifying is they have the Corps of Engineers has 4 accounts technically. They have NED, RED, other social effects, and environmental quality. So their other social effects account, which is basically like socioeconomics, the number of people that are affected by flood risk and whatnot. What they did is they said, okay, these are the number of households that no longer have to pay flood premiums. But it doesn't go into the economic analysis. It does not.
And I didn't get to review the Corps' feasibility analysis for the FM diversion. I used to at one time. I worked for the Secretary of the Army, and under us was the Corps of Engineers. And one of my jobs was to take 10 feasibility studies at a time that come in from all over the country that are developed by Corps economists, and to find the one that was least bad. Because every one of them you can find fatal flaws in there where the economists, the Corps wants to build projects. That's what keeps them going. Where was I going with that? I'm not sure either.
Anyone else? Yeah, let's get your mic here.
So my question is about the environmental benefits of a project. There is a term that I learned in school called non-use value of water. How do we quantify that on a, say, dam removal project? Where you have a dam, there's a value for that dam to be in place for environmental reasons, for local residents' benefits reasons. How do you quantify that into this model?
There's a whole plethora of values. One is use values, people that actually use it. One is existence values. People value something just because it exists. Many of you probably haven't seen a black rhinoceros, but you probably value the existence of black rhinoceros. You might never visit one. Another type of value is bequest value. Again, the black rhinoceros, you don't care about it, but you want your descendants to be able to see a black rhinoceros. Option value.
Option and altruistic.
There's no such thing as altruistic. We might have a dispute here. Option value is I value it because someday I might go see it. I did some work on black rhinos because people would shoot them and they'd cut the horn off and sell it to the Asians for a lot of money. So what we decided to do was just cut the horn off while they were alive, and then there'd be no incentive to shoot the rhino. Altruism. Altruism is doing something just out of the kindness of your heart. That doesn't exist. What exists, this is your individual utility curve. Whatever you do, you get utility from it. If you feel good, that's not altruism.
True.
If you give money to the church or give money to a cause, makes you feel good. You're getting satisfaction from that. So there's no such thing as altruism. So that's his challenge, is to find something that is an example of altruistic behavior.
I won't debate you here on that one today. So.
You'll get me later.
Yeah, and so just adding to that in terms of non-use values. So first off, there are the use values from like a dam. So if we think about fishing, there's the value of the fish. Recreators go out and you catch your fish, you take it, and you either consumptively take it or you non-consumptively put it back, catch and release, and somebody else can come and enjoy it.
That's the more common characterization, is consumptive versus non-consumptive.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think here from, like, if we talk about the non-use value of water, we normally relate those to specific resources, though, too. That's the only thing I would add. The couple of examples I can think of where maybe it's not as, there's values of stream flows that are just generally applied to environmental amenities. Like, so the aesthetic value of a stream is kind of one of those non-use values that, so if you have a riparian area that has a nice green ecosystem, that's one of those non-use values that we would apply from the value of water. What does that water, contribute to that riparian system?
And we could either look in the literature, or we could go around and ask somebody using a contingent valuation study, how much would you pay to have this improvement in water quality, or how much would you pay to have this change in in-stream flows? So we have tools to measure all of those non-use values.
Otherwise, we relate them to specific resources, like a non-use value for a fish. The common one are salmon in the Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of value. So, for example, use values tend to be very high. So, like, those are the ones that are published, like a recreator receives $135 per day in terms of value for going out and catching one single salmon. However, non-use values tend to be very low on a per person basis. And the reason why is because those are generalized across the entire population. So if you think of the value to yourself, the value of a salmon, knowing that it exists in the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia River Basin, is, if I tell you it's $5, well, that's $5 to you, but if we extrapolate that entire value across the entire population, everyone receives $5 in benefit. Non-use values are huge. So if we have recreators, 15,000 recreators per year go out and catch fish at $135 per fish, that's the use value, and it's somewhat large. It's a large value. But then now we apply that $5 across 150 million people. All of a sudden, what does that non-use value come in? Now, if we apply that, obviously in this framework, the state economic development framework, we would only be concerned with the non-use values attributable to the population of the state of North Dakota. So, just kind of.
It's not the economist's job to come up with the list of values. It's the planner and the engineer's job, when they design the project, to tell us these are all the things this project is going to produce, including non-use values, this, and this. And then we'll assign values to it, or do survey work, or somehow we'll come up with values. But it's the planner's job, the one who knows the project intimately, to tell us what that project does in terms of benefits to whomever, wherever, whenever in the state of North Dakota, if the state is paying for it.
And so getting back to the model too, kind of relating this all back, we have, again, a standardized set of or values in the model that are kind of a starting point for this. So for example, with environmental aspect of it, we have recreation values, and to avoid double counting, we've cut it out and said, okay, we have, I think, habitat restoration. No, we didn't. We included recreation only because it's hard to net out the value of the wetlands and the habitat restoration against recreation, because when you think about habitat restoration values, one component of that is actually going to be those recreators that go out and enjoy the increased number of birds that go to the site, and the value of groundwater recharge. But also the issue with using habitat restoration value that Jay and I talked about in developing this model is habitat restoration is one of those things that it's really dependent on scale as well and quality. So if we have like a small, like 1 acre site, versus a site that's going to be 100 acres. There's going to be a difference in quality, so we can't put a value in the model that says, oh, it's $135 per acre of habitat restoration is the benefit that's going to come out of it. Because really, that 1 acre site isn't going to have the same quality as like 100 acres would. So that was one where we decided to kind of whittle it down and just use recreation as a starting point, both consumptive and non-consumptive, and then we have the other benefits. So
You identify them, we'll put values on them. If when you're using these models, you think of something that isn't included, well then consult an economist and we'll put that in there. I recently reviewed a benefit cost study that valued wetlands in west central Minnesota at $230,000 an acre. That's what I said. It's, you can't hardly step without stepping in a wetland. Maybe in Central Park it's worth $230,000 an acre, but not in west central Minnesota. Many of these benefits are like real estate, location, location, location. Are they scarce there? What kind of functions are they providing that can be valued there? You look perplexed. It's just a natural look. Okay. We're friends, I can pick on her.
why don't we
Determining what those would be in.
Just be reasonable.
Yeah.
There's a lot of emphasis now, at least in Minnesota, about pollinator habitat. So you stick 10 acres of pollinator habitat in there and value it at $100,000 an acre. Well, that's not very reasonable. Dave doesn't like pollinator habitat? We have one. Oh, okay. So there's somebody that you wouldn't want to interview on the value of pollinator habitat. How much is it worth to you? Because Jeremy said $5 times everybody in the state. That's not true. Because for everybody that likes it, there may be somebody that doesn't like it.
True.
One time when I was little, I was swimming in the Columbia River and a salmon bit my little toe off. I just absolutely hate salmon. So not everybody likes, you have to consider the dislikes as well as the likes.
Yeah.
The costs as well as the benefits. So every time you come up with a wild ass benefit, I'll come up with an equally big wild ass cost. So let's try neither one of us doing that.
All right, one more question, and then we'll move to the model here. Oh,
You're talking about valuations and picking a number based on survey of a lot of numbers.
Many different ways to do it, yeah. Survey of a lot of numbers is called meta-analysis.
Can you talk a little bit about the model and how you deal with that band around the most likely value from high to low?
We just plugged a number in there.
Okay.
One number. If you, the analyst, when you're doing this for the economic analysis, think that number isn't right, you can put a different number in there, but then justify it. Because we know every number, there's a range around there. Yeah. Now, some people, if they're trying to promote something, they'll pick this end of the range. Other people will pick this end. We tried to pick the middle.
median values.
Yeah, start in the middle and, well, again, $230,000 an acre for wetlands in west central Minnesota, that's not reasonable.
There's a measure of subjectivity, a little bit of professional judgment, and then also if we gather a large enough sample from literature, then you can compute like a median value or look at like the whole range of values and kind of pick the middle. And the upper and lower are boundaries here. So.
And for a lot of these issues that we're talking about, Jeremy mentioned sensitivity analysis. The result isn't very sensitive to changes in some of these assumptions, because that by the time you get done discounting it, it's only a small part of the project. You could triple the value and it still isn't going to change the result.
Yeah.
So don't spend a lot of time and effort trying to chase some rabbits down a hole that aren't going to make much difference.
Why don't we take a 10-minute break? I'm going to pull the models up. We'll walk through we have an example for the urban model and for the rural model. And then if there are any other questions, we can go through those. And that'll be it. So let's regroup here at 2:15. On this how-to, you've got an explanation of what you'll find on each of the worksheets, where you can go to input data. So you have the project overview that has your where you're going to fill out the applicant, point of contact, description of the project. That's where you're going to enter your construction costs and your annual O&M. There's 3 input worksheets. Worksheet 2, inputs. This is kind of your primary input space. Input worksheet 3, which is your EA, rural flood damages. So this is where you're going to enter some of the specific information about crop losses, natural resource enhancement, benefits such as water quality, and some of that information. And then if you're doing urban flood damages, where you're entering information about properties that are subject to flooding, that's where you input that data. And then we have a results summary, the detail, which shows the present value calculations. It's similar to the life cycle cost analysis model, where we had a high-level results summary and then the detail of of all the calculations in each year. There's some background calculations that are shown in the urban other calculations. This, if you want to look at how the model is calculating transportation damages, that's a place you can look. We have a model definitions page that shows you some of the inputs and associated units, and then there's a miscellaneous functions worksheet. But again, where you'll be primarily concerned are sheets 1 through 4 for kind of getting into the inputting the data, and then 5 and 6 for actually reviewing the results. So this particular example that we came up with yesterday, Jay, is it correct in saying that this is based on an example that you're familiar with? Somewhat.
No, that's not correct.
No?
It's based on several examples.
Okay.
Several
examples.
It's an example we did to demonstrate some things to the audience.
Yeah. So we're assuming here the name of this project, it's Eddy County Drain 12. And the purpose of the project is to increase conveyance capacity of Drain 12 to reduce agricultural flood damages. So we have a project sponsor, county. In this case, because it's rural and agricultural damages, we're not concerned about city and population served. The project area is roughly 12,000 acres in Eddy County. Project costs. We plugged in a project cost of roughly $10 million in construction, generic real estate, planning, engineering, and design, construction management. Notice that these, the construction management is a percentage based on construction. And then contingency, we've hard-coded a value of 25% into the model. You don't have to use that. You can plug in your own contingency if necessary. But the model came preset with a contingency of 25%. We're assuming an annual O&M of $5,000. Again, when you're actually doing a project, you would come up with an O&M estimate, just like you would on the life cycle cost analysis. Real quick, thinking about O&M, when I've done projects, O&M can be something as simple as just going out and bullet pointing a list of activities that you would undertake and how frequent you might do them. For example, a Corps of Engineers project I recently worked on, we figured that there was going to be embankment improvements, so we figured there's going to be mowing, there's going to be some site monitoring, there's going to be some site cleanup periodically, maybe some dredging or clean out of the culverts, and then periodic inspections. 5 activities is what we came up with for O&M on this particular project. We plugged in some labor hours for the different activities. We figured fuel and time to go out and mow. It's pretty straightforward to put together an O&M estimate for something like that. So the reason why I say that is because coming up with an O&M estimate isn't as hard as a lot of people think it should be, or is. So kind of keeping it in mind with what we talked about here today, with the level of detail and sufficiency to come up with a reasonable estimate, you can do something like that with O&M. Okay, so getting into the inputs worksheet, we're using a base year of 2018. The gray values indicate calculations here, so we're assuming 50-year period of life is already, or period of analysis is already plugged into the model, so it goes through 2069. Discount factor, 3%. Wait, that's not right. Is that rounded? Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Although no one's accused me of having a soft voice, but so permanent flood protection.
Yep.
We're predicting that they will go beyond 50 years. And in an economic analysis, would that not be a benefit to your program to figure out what that year would be rather than 50 years, just standard?
Wait, what do you, okay, define permanent protection though.
So flood walls, levees, things like that. We're expecting them to last more than 50 years. Could we figure that, wouldn't that improve our economic analysis result?
Well, not necessarily, because first off, if your benefits go past 50 years, think about back to discounting. So those future benefits are going to be discounted heavily. If you run this out 500 years, those benefits, you might have $10,000 per year in benefits, nominal, but discounted in 100 years, 150 years, we're talking $10. So those future streams of benefits that are coming in are so small that you're talking rounding error, when you get out very far. Also, the issue that with permanent protection, I think is a little bit of a misnomer commonly because, like, for example, flood walls, levees, those are still subject to failure. They are subject to rehab costs. So we can call them permanent protection, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to require some level of restoration, particularly with levees that are subject to you have a major flood event and then you have a repair to actually restore them to operational level. The other thing we can say too is, like, you might design a levee today to 100-year level of protection, but what do we know? There's uncertainty about the future. Does that mean your hydraulic conditions are going to remain the same? So what if peak runoff changes and now your 100-year is only a 50-year, right? So your design level has changed, and so because of uncertainty, that future condition, those benefits that we estimated today that you're getting aren't the same in 100 years. So those things come into play in terms of the benefit stream. So that's the reason why running 50 years is a reasonable life also. And again, calling it permanent protection, yes, the levee might be in place permanently, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be things that occur over the life of the project to either keep it operational or to maintain that level of protection.
I think you answered the question to begin with, and any benefits beyond 50 years are discounted, so they may only add 3-4% to the total present value of the benefits. And if you need those 3 or 4% to get over 1, it's a risky project to start with.
Yeah.
So the first, I think, and fullest answer is they're discounted beyond 50 years, so they aren't going to do much for you.
Yep. So a quick point I just noticed here, the model that we actually sent out has a 3% discount factor in there, and I think it's because I was playing with the model the other day and changed it from 2.875 to 3%, so I need to send it back to you with the 2.875, so.
It doesn't matter.
I know, it's rounding error, it really is, so. Okay, so project costs and annual O&M are pulled over from the project overview worksheet. Recurrence interval is only something you need to worry about if you're doing the urban worksheet, which we'll go through in a few minutes. Now, we're assuming that this project is going to provide some consumptive and non-consumptive recreation. So there's going to be some users that go out there and do a little bit of fishing. So we're going to get about 100 users per day, 5 days per, or sorry, yeah, 100 users per day, 5 days per year.
100 users per year, 5 days per user.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And then consumptively, 100 users per year, seven days of visitation per year. Let's see here. We could have added in some transportation benefits. We chose to keep this simple. I do have a transportation calculation on the urban example, but again, maybe you have a roadway that's not going to flood or whatnot. You can easily plug that information in, and I'll show how that's put together on the urban one.
You want to make sure the Schwann's truck can still get to you.
Right. One common example maybe where that could be important, though, is emergency access. You know, one of the common things that I see in flood control project where transportation benefits are key really is rural access for EMS, emergency response, fire trucks, police, those things. Because really, as we've seen in some other projects that Jay and I worked on recently in North Dakota, or are those North Dakota projects? Or Minnesota projects, sorry. Minnesota projects, transportation benefits in rural county roads, not very important. Not very big benefits, I should say.
Not big to society or the state, but big to the person that drives on them.
Right. Yeah.
Jeremy, on that last data entry sheet, there are the lodging costs per day and meal costs per day.
Yep.
Can you speak to those? And why would they be in on a project like this? Just, I mean, because aren't those related to displacement?
Yeah, so these are actually just starting values. Those are related to displacement costs that are really on the urban model. They're just in here kind of as a starting point. What we use those as a source, or where we got those as a source is from the U.S. GSA, Department of GSA. They have published values for like per diem rates for lodging and meals. That's usually a generally accepted approach to valuing displacement costs during flood activities, but also for volunteer hours for flood fighting too. So that's the reason why those values are in here. You can modify them as needed, but I didn't delete them or anything since we're doing the rural example, but they don't have a role in this particular calculation. So.
Jeremy, I couldn't see that when I got a little ways back. Could you blow it up a little more?
Yeah. Let's see here. Let's see. Sorry, I'm working with Pat's Mac here, and I'm not used to working with Excel in this here. Let's see if that works. There we go. So that's where we had these values I just highlighted. So then the rural example. So this example, thinking about the process of doing an EA I talked about before. So you establish your baseline, you value or figure out your alternatives, and then quantify your benefits and costs, and thinking about this at the margin here. So in order to do like a marginal analysis and what our baseline condition is, we're calculating all benefits from calculating our without project and our with project. And the difference between those two, thinking about at the margin, are our incremental impacts or benefits to the project. So under each of these different subsets, you'll see where we have, you've got to enter data for your existing or without project condition and then your with project condition. So the example Jay and I kind of went through here is we're assuming there's acres of pasture and cropland that are flooded. 90% of those are cropland, 10% of those are pasture acres. So for the 2 through 100 year event, you'll see we've plugged in acres of farmland. You can do this in a number of ways. You could go out and if you have FIS mapping or whatever, you can look at an aerial, or you can have some GIS exercise to quantify those acres and inventory just the general area of how much flooding there is.
And just to point out the top row there, the 2-year flood, you can see way over on the right, the average annual damage is 39,000. The 100-year flood, which floods 10 times as much land, the average annual flood is 8,000. So that's a function of the probability of that flood occurring.
Right.
So you're really well off controlling 2, 5, 10, maybe 25-year floods. And then it becomes more and more costly the lower the frequency of the flood you're trying to protect too.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jay. So one of the, kind of taking a step back here, one of the things that is key in doing like a flood or flood conveyance analysis and looking at damages from flooding is we have a range of events that we usually look at, right? So I guess going back to your example yesterday, Jay, about the 500-year event. Well, you have a 500-year event that has large range of damages, and if we compare that to a cost, that's one thing. But really, in order to think about like an economic framework, we have to incorporate the probability of that event occurring. So the way we do flood damage analysis is to look at the full range of floods, say for example, like a 2 through 100 year. We calculate each of the damages for each of those events, and then we weight each of those events by the probability and sum that area under the curve, or sum all of those damages, and that gets us the total damage across the range of those events that we call average annual. So that's the reason why you're providing each of these values, and as Jay mentioned, one of the things that's interesting that occurs with this type of analysis is if you have an event that, if you have a lot of flooding at the, say, the 2 through 25 year rainfall event, and your project is, say, targeted to a 25-year protection, you can get a lot more benefit than you can if you have like a 500-year project, because when we incorporate the probability of a 500-year, even though you might have $1 billion in damages, what's 1 billion times 0.002? It's it's a much smaller number. So if you have to spend $150 million against that 0.002 probability to alleviate $1 billion in damages, all of a sudden your benefit cost ratio is not there.
Yeah, the big problem is we don't know what year the 500-year flood is going to happen.
Right.
If we knew, this would be easy. We'd plug it into year 37, discount it to present value, bingo. But it could happen next year, 1 in 500 chance, or it could happen in year 500, a 1 in 500 year chance.
Or it could happen in year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5,
Yep.
and then it could just never happen again.
Yep.
We just don't know.
Yep.
So yeah, getting back to this here, so you enter the acres of farmland. We have assumed here that this project is going to alleviate damages to the 25-year and less, and because of attenuation, it's going to reduce the 50 and the 100-year as well. So you'll see here we've calculated the average annual damages at 148,000 under the without project, and then the with project residual damages, that is the damages that are left over after the project's in place, our average annual are 6.3. So our benefit is the difference between those numbers. Those aren't the only benefits though. So we've said here, we've gone out and we've looked, and there's some farmsteads on some of those properties. So do a quick inventory, and we found, okay, well, at the 50-year, there's 5 farmsteads that are flooded. At the 12-year, there's 12. With the project, those 5 that were flooded under the 50-year aren't in the floodplain anymore, but there's 3 under the 100-year that still are. So we have a value here for those. Then we've got bank erosion. Jay, do you want to talk about where that value came from?
Yeah, since we didn't have an actual project, we just assumed for 2 and 5 year floods, there's no bank erosion.
Yeah.
10 year, you get a little more, 25 more, 100 year more. We plugged some numbers in as examples.
Yeah. So we've got snagging and clearing and sediment removal are the same way.
Same story.
Yeah. But again, you know, the with project, we're assuming some of those benefits, you know, those damages are reduced, and under each case, we're calculating the benefit in terms of the reduction between the without and the with project condition. So over here also, if you had detour benefits, those would be added in. If you have some stored water, acre feet of stored water, notice that's what we're counting as, that's the only one where there's not a without project condition, because this is counted as a new benefit or a new element of the project. And so that one is where you would just plug in the acre feet of stored water and it would compute that as a benefit. So all of those values, all of those average annual values are then pulled over to this worksheet, the EA detail. And under each of these categories, the model computes the damage reduction for each year. And it also has the construction costs and your annual O&M. All of these are discounted. The model sums them, and then they feed over to your results summary. Okay.
And Pat pointed out that although I plucked the numbers of acres out of the air, and where'd Zach go? There he is. I taught Zach Herman how to do this. He's an engineer and he caught on in about 2 hours. So it's not that hard. But the number that you multiply the 1,000 acres times is $100 an acre average annual flood damages. That's an empirically derived number. That's a real number from Norman County, Minnesota. And in North Dakota counties, we adjusted based on average county rental rates. The cost for ditch maintenance, those are all real numbers as well. The only numbers we made up were the number of acres that were affected and the feet of ditch that was affected. The costs, the damages, the cost to repair are real numbers.
Yep. And here's where those input values are. You'll see here that they're grayed out, but these are the values. So we had cropland damage per acre, $100 per acre. Erosion, $40 per foot. And this is linear foot, I should say. Clearing costs per foot. Sediment removal. Stored water, $1 per acre foot. So that's where all of these values are housed. If you want to take a look and see, these all feed into those calculation worksheets.
And the $100 an acre for cropland is the result of a lot of time and effort working in Norman County. So that number is pretty rock solid. It's an average annual based on all of those probabilities, based on the crops that they grow, based on the prices that are provided by ERCS. They update the prices every year.
So all of these values feed over to this results summary worksheet. And this gets to where I was talking about before. If you do have a project that's going to have both urban and rural benefits, plug them both in. You'll see here, you know, it'll segregate the benefits here between the urban and rural project features or project components. But either way, they all add up to total benefits, you know, at the bottom, and that's what is going into the benefit cost ratio. So we take present value, then we take those, and there's something that we do a little bit different from life cycle cost analysis that we also do occasionally with benefit cost analysis, which is we convert everything back to what we call average annual. The idea here is if you were to think about I like to use the home mortgage example, and that's amortizing. You amortize the present value and the interest of your house over the 30-year mortgage. We do the same thing here with the present value benefits and costs, and we basically amortize them over the 50-year period using the discount rate to get us what you would think of as the the average benefit that could occur on an annual basis, taking into account the range of events that could occur and the 50-year period period of analysis of the project. So based on what we've plugged in, we had 22.9 million in benefits, or on an average annual basis, roughly $900,000 in benefits per year. So we had 13,000 in project cost.
13 million.
13 million in, in capital costs, and an average annual O&M of 130,000 per year, which works out to be an average annual cost of 516,000 over the life of the project. So going back to our project metrics, we have benefit cost ratio, which is benefits divided by costs. So if we divide that 889 divided by 516, we get a benefit cost ratio of 1.7. Net benefits, or net present value, benefits minus costs, gets us a total present value net benefit of 9.6, or on an average annual basis, roughly $374,000 $374,000 in benefit per year for every dollar invested. The internal rate of return, this gets back to that discount factor that that drives benefits to equal to costs. This is saying that we currently have a discount factor of 3% in the model. This is saying that the discount rate could actually be 6% and you'd still break even on the project.
So you're getting a good return on your investment. You're getting 6%.
Right. Internal rate of return is very similar then to payback year. So this is saying then it would based on all the benefits that are quantified, those benefits would return the initial investment costs within 15 years. Make sense? So every year after year 15 is added benefit over the initial investment cost. Okay. Any questions on the rural example before I move to the urban? Yeah, in the back there. This screen? Or
yes, well, where I saw a cost in there for the federal mileage rate.
Yep.
$54.50 a mile.
That's the new federal rate.
Okay.
That's to pay for the wall.
I just caught that, and I wondered how much that's going to change if we get that down to where to the 54 cents instead of $54.
We didn't include any detour.
Yeah, there's no transportation in this one, so.
That was Jeremy that did that.
Yep. Fix that.
Good eyes.
Any other questions? Nope. Okay, let me switch models here real quick.
Okay.
So this one I actually, so we've already walked through the title page of the how-to. This is an example I actually pulled from a recent project I worked on in Colorado in terms of the data inputs, but it is applicable here. So you're doing a flood retention basin here, and the basin will contain flows up to the 100-year project, or 100-year return period, and reduce properties to over 100, or reduce flooding to over 100 properties. So these were real construction costs for the retention basin, $3.2 million, real estate of $500,000, planning, engineering, and design of $500,000, construction management of $259,000, contingency of $811,000. Annual O&M is $15,000. And let me zoom in on this one here. Okay. So this is where you're going to need to enter the recurrence intervals, because what we're assuming here is for the urban model, you might be working with different recurrence intervals, and it's not always consistent in terms of what you have for hydraulic information, so we've allowed you to key that information in specifically. So in this case, this particular analysis looked at the 5, the 10, 50, 100, and we defined level of protection as 100-year. As I mentioned, there's a travel impact here. So there are 500 vehicles per day going across a particular county roadway. Normal drive time was about 15 minutes. The detour drive time was 25 minutes. And then in terms of duration of closure, there's no closure for the 5 or the 10-year event, roughly 5 hours at the 50-year event, and 24 hours at the 100-year event. And then all of those damages were alleviated with the project. So, entering data for the urban analysis is pretty straightforward, and let me zoom in on this here. So, there's a lot of ways to do urban flood damage analysis. Usually the best way is to gather information from like a county assessor, and then you can code the data pretty easily. So what we've given you here are just a few general categories that have enough information in them to do a reasonable flood damage analysis. So we've kind of depth damage curves, which are used to estimate flood damages, which are basically, they relate depth of flooding to the structure itself and estimate a percent damage based on depth of flooding. There's a whole slew of curves out there available from the Corps of Engineers. In fact, like residential structures alone, there's probably like 20 different curves because you have with and without basement. You have 1-story, 2-story, 3-story apartments. Then there's some districts will have different curves depending on the type of construction. So whether it's brick and mortar or whether it's wood construction. So there's a whole slew of curves that are available. What we've done is we've said, okay, you know what? These curves are close enough in type anyway that we're going to use the 1-story with basement and we've combined the 2- and 3-story to a 2+story with basement. And that is going to be good enough to give a reasonable example of flood damages here.
Jeremy, could you zoom in just a little bit so they can see what you can choose there?
Yeah. So here,
I want to point out a difference between the urban and the rural. In urban setting, if your house gets flooded for 2 minutes, that's damage. In rural setting, the crop depends on the time during the growing season, what crop it is. There are some crops during certain parts of the growing season that can be underwater for 3 days.
Yep.
And there's a very complicated chart for this part of the country that shows how much water each type of crop can take during different periods of the growing season in order to affect harvest. So that's a big difference between your house flooding and a cornfield flooding.
Yep. Actually, apparently zooming in doesn't change the drop-down bars at all. But, so we have public, commercial, apartments, and industrial. So those are the other categories. And again, we've combined, like for commercial and industrial, there's a whole slew of curves: transportation, warehousing, industrial light manufacturing, office space, medical, retail. We basically combined those and select a curve that's representative of all these different categories and applied them here. So what you need to do is enter information about each structure, select the structure type. If it's residential, if you provide the square footage, we've plugged in a standard value for replacement value of that structure, and it will calculate the value of the structure, okay? If it's commercial, industrial, or public, you'll need to provide a value, and usually an assessor's database is a good estimate of those values. For example, like if you have a commercial property, you can go out and look at the assessed value for a commercial development and have the value of the building that you can use in the analysis. Pat?
And just without the header in there, the model does know that those are in thousands.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Right there. Structure value in thousands. So, okay, so you can see here these are computed values. One other key thing here for structure damage analysis is we need to know the elevation of the structure relative to the ground. So FEMA has some literature that they've gone out across the country and surveyed different damage inventories, and they have a report that has foundation heights relative to ground. Because when you think about damages, you have the structure, you have the ground, and then somewhere in there is where the flood water is, right? So what we need to know is the relative elevation of the structure, or the structure's first floor where the water can get in relative to the ground and the foundation. So we took the FEMA report, coded those values, and so we provided information on both the structure value and the foundation height. So really all you need to do is give it square footage, name for the structure, and then what we have here are the depths of flooding at each of the structures. So I've pulled this information from another study. And then obviously this is 100-year level of protection, so none of these structures flood after the 100-year. The reason why I did this, you'll see all of these negative 999s. In this particular study, what we were doing is to depth damage curves go down to -8 feet relative to the foundation height. So we just plugged in a negative 999 to make sure that it doesn't compute damages for those structures. So it goes through the same process. Damages are calculated. Let's see here. The model also computes, let's see here. This is where the transportation impacts occur. So, where am I looking? Okay, so for each of these categories, the model then computes, pulls a relative depth damage curve. It computes damages to the property, to the contents, displacement costs, that is the amount of time that people would be displaced due to flooding for each of these different return periods. And then all of that information goes through an average annual calculation, just like we did under the simplified urban setting. And then all of that information gets pulled over here to your results worksheet, and I'll zoom in on this here. Okay, so flood mitigation benefits, a total of 16.5 thousand over the life of the project, or 16.5 million, sorry. Total benefits, flood fighting, social benefits, travel time delays come out to be 38 million. This, again, gets pulled over to the results summary. So now you'll see here, we have our flood mitigation benefits up top. Roughly 20 million in total present value benefits, or on an average annual basis, 760,000, versus the capital costs of that project. So benefit cost ratio of 3.4. And for some reason, the IRR isn't computing, even though it just worked on the other model. I'll double check that.
I'd like to point out one other thing. The numbers Jeremy uses for damages are based on some federal data.
Yep.
And the feds assume that the contents are 75% of the value of the house. You leave your car parked in the garage. There's no warning. You don't move anything out of the basement. The flood comes like it came in Michigan a couple times ago. So these numbers are pretty generous with respect to damages. Red River floods, you know, we got 2 months warning. We take everything out of the basement. We move our car to high ground. So these are generous estimates for this part of the country. They're meant more for flash type of flooding.
Yeah. So the data entry for the urban flood damage analysis is pretty straightforward. Again, I just basically pulled this right from a model that I recently put together probably about 6 months ago. And actually I did a comparison. So in that particular model, we had very detailed structure categories for probably about 12 different types of structures versus what we're using here with 6. And the results, probably the benefit cost ratio is maybe 0.2 or 0.3 different, I think, in terms of the actual end results. So again, kind of getting back to that idea of how close, you know, are we 80, 90%? it came out pretty close in terms of comparability for the damages that the model was computing, even with those minor tweaks and reducing or trimming down the number of damage categories that we had in the model. So, are there questions? Kind of gone through these examples, I feel like pretty quick, but at the same time, you know, a lot of this is laid out in the guidance in terms of what you would fill in and where, so. It's 3 o'clock and people are winding down, maybe. Jay? Questions?
I'm aware of a project in west central Minnesota where we, the state, spent $5 million on a ring dike to protect 42 houses with an average value of $53,000. That's over $100,000 on the dike to protect 42 houses with an average value of $53,000. Why did we do that?
Good question. Why did we do that?
Because there are other metrics in the equation that legislators and decision makers use other than the benefit cost ratio. The benefit cost ratio on that project was something under 0.5. But there were some other overwhelming factors that whoever's allocating the money thought that that should be built anyway.
Yeah.
If it would have been me, I would have just paid each homeowner $75,000 and walked away from it and been money ahead.
Something else kind of along that point too. So ring levy is technically a non-structural project. This model can be used to evaluate not just structural projects like detention basins or levees, but also you could do like non-structural. Like if you're going to do property buyouts, well, you could do it the same way I just did. You evaluate the baseline flood conditions, and then damages would be basically you take the property out, it shouldn't flood under any of the return periods. So zero all of those damages out, and that would be your way of evaluating a non-structural project, like buyouts or elevating properties, things like that. So that was something I forgot to mention earlier. Yeah, in the back there.
Start over.
So you have $100 an acre for damages, and I'm assuming there's some type of assumed distribution of floods through the growing season. I'm just curious if that distribution of floods and resultant dollar value changes depending on where you're at in the state.
At this time, the dollar value doesn't change. The distribution of floods during the growing season is what the engineers tell us. That's part of their input. The dollar value doesn't change. The 100 is a net.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, if it looks like changing the 100 is going to make a big difference on the outcome, then the 100 should be changed. But if it's going to change from 100 to 102, it isn't worth changing.
So the previous question you brought up, if the property's bought out and they leave, so how do you account for 5,000 people moving out of a city and you have those lost jobs or the lost income or however you want to say for a project area then?
Well, that's your regional economic impacts. That's not part of the economic analysis test.
That's one of the other factors the decision makers put in the overall decision-making process.
Yep.
Is the 5,000 people that moved away.
Yep. Pat?
I would just mention that, when going back to Jay's comments and talking about the different values and multipliers that are included in here, they are all outlined and cited within the guidance. So if you're wondering where those numbers came from that they're using, they're in the guidance.
Yep. Anyone else? Pat, did you want to make any closing comments?
Come on, let's make Jeremy earn his money. Ask him some questions.
Or Jay for that matter, too. Oh, over here. One more.
Go ahead.
So when you roll this out and in the first year, you know, users are going to have a lot of questions. What's the, I guess, user support for asking questions? What resources are there for that?
Good question.
The tall guy in the corner of the room.
We will provide as much support as we can, but we may need some help with that depending upon the complexity of the questions that we get. Yes.
Yeah, all questions, comments, concerns, suggestions, funnel them through Pat's office. We made it clear you weren't going to get a signed copy from me.
For the rural piece, if you're looking at a reconstruct, so we've got a lot of legal drains that are 100 years old. They're functioning today, but they're falling apart. They need to be reconstructed. So you're looking at benefits. Many of the benefits of the reconstructed channel might already be there when you look at the model, but do you look at it as if the drain is not there today and compare it to the reconstructed facility so that you're looking at the true value of the project? Or do you have to compare it today to the reconstructed piece and say, it's just not going to function much longer, but the benefits aren't going to show very much because you've already got a ditch?
Jay, do you want to
Well,
tackle that one first?
if the ditch needs to be reconstructed and must not be doing its job entirely, so you take the without project condition, the ditch that is not performing fully, and compare it to the with project condition, a brand new, fully functioning ditch. So you start with a few benefits from the ditch because it is doing something.
It's just not doing as much as it's designed to, right?
You never know. What if it is doing as much, but it's eroding into the field adjacent? Then you've got that erosion piece. I
And you
suppose.
put some side inlets in
There's
there.
the other benefits that hopefully add up. But
yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else? Yep.
On the urban piece, it looked like all of the inputs are structural. Structures. What if you've got benefits to roadway? You've got benefits from not is that part of the regional stuff? Like evacuating a nursing home has a benefit. Not evacuating a nursing home has a benefit, I should say. Is there any way to build that into this, or is that just what you should note in your report when you're selling it to the decision makers?
So if you can monetize something, like if we can put a value on, so you're talking about avoiding evacuating the
Let's say loss of life even.
Yeah.
If you've got that and you can show, yep, I fully believe this will save 3 lives. There's federal dollar amounts that you can put on a human life because like the professor noted, there's a cost on everything.
Yeah. Yeah, there are, I believe we had a space to add some benefits. I'll double check that.
Okay.
Because there was a way to actually add, at one point we had additional rows where you could plug in a dollar value associated with additional benefits, and that would immediately come over to the calculation worksheet and just run that out. I'll just double check that that's in
And you'd
there.
have to tie that right back to your recurrence interval for the benefits of each level.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
So you can do side calculations and plug that in.
If you have to evacuate a nursing home, that's part of the economic analysis. That there's a cost to that.
Yeah.
You also have to include the benefit of the persons in the nursing home that they're getting from being evacuated. It's the most excitement they've had for years. Okay, but there certainly is a cost to evacuate them, to put them up for 2 weeks, and to bring them back again. That's a legitimate part of the costs averted.
So you could actually handle it in a couple of different ways. You could either calculate that benefit separately, or if you already know, like, if you want to treat it like as an apartment, for example, and you have like a physical damage to it, the apartment curve has a displacement cost associated with it based on an assumed square footage. You could just do a hand calculation and then also plug the value in there like as an apartment. and see how comparable the estimates are. Maybe that's a ballpark that you can use. So there's a number of ways that you could probably plug it in. It just depends. And again, I think there's going to be kind of case-by-case examples that are kind of like small one-offs that might come into play where there might be a question about it, and those are the kind of things that you might ask Pat about, like what's the best way to handle this? We have this one-off condition that we want to evaluate. And so those are the things that either you can plug it in as a separate benefit category, or you can maybe find a way to get it through what's already in the model.
So with respect to loss of life, earlier we saw an example of value of open space in Williams County versus Orange County. It's going to be different. Similarly, for loss of life, on one of the projects that we are working on, even though there is no direct loss of life at that structure in the past, but we have documented fatalities on other structures within the state in the past. Would that or could that be used to justify a benefit?
I would say yes, if you can document and justify including the loss of life as a cost averted, that should be part of the benefit. In Fargo-Moorhead, for example, there's never been a life lost due to flooding. There have been 12 losses due to one tornado. So we should prevent tornadoes and not floods, because life is priceless. I'm just being sarcastic.
I worked on a hurricane protection system in New York after the Hurricane Sandy work, or Hurricane Sandy is part of the post-recovery flood work. And one of the things that actually came out of a lot of studies by both Health and Human Services and New York and FEMA, that they found that a lot of the flood-related accidents and fatalities actually weren't necessarily directly related to floods. They're indirectly related. So what happens with a flood, you have a power outage, you lose a substation, or you lose some connection to the electrical grid, power goes out. And then what happens, you can't see in the dark, and somebody trips and falls down the stairs, and either they're trapped or they suffer a significant injury and end up dying. And so actually it's an indirect effect related to floods, and it's not necessarily directly related to the flood. So that's actually one of the things that we ended up finding. And that's part of the reason why we didn't count under some of those flood studies that we were looking at, like with FEMA and whatnot on the East Coast, is we didn't count flood losses because of the indirect nature of the flooding also.
And it's not fun talking about fatalities, but you also could use a control area.
Yeah.
What happened in this area the previous 10 years during this time period? How many deaths were there?
Yep.
There may have been 6, and during the flood there may have been 6. But the flood may have caused those 6, but there were 6 before.
Yeah.
I used to think about that when in Vietnam, for example, 58,000 of my colleagues didn't come back. Well, how many of the people who avoided the draft got killed instead of going there? You need to control. Yeah. We need to lighten this up a little bit.
We got really morbid really quick.
Yeah. We, the Army, ran over a woman on a road in Honduras, and we had to pay her family $6,000. When you were talking about the value of a life, I was thinking, well, us North Dakotans, we're worth about $6 million. Those people in Orange County, 50,000. I'm just kidding. There's different ways to figure the value of a life. Me, I'm old. From society's perspective, I don't have much value left. No productive value. But if I was his age, I'd be much more valuable from society's perspective. Yeah.
We call it the value of a statistical life.
Yep. And there are plenty of sources you can come up with a number.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
This has been fun.
Yeah. Just a reminder on your way out, if you could sign in if you didn't already.
Yeah, that was really the only thing that I had left is we want to make sure that we have everybody's contact information that was here today. So yeah, there's sheets over at the table over there. If you have not signed in, if you could do that, we would appreciate that. As we mentioned before, this, you know, we did record this and captured via video. So we'll try to put all that together and ultimately we'll be able to offer that on our website for those folks that weren't able to be here today. Other than that, I don't think I have anything else. Thanks to HDR and for everybody that was at the workshop today. Very much appreciated. With that, I guess that's all we'd have.